Good evening. Welcome to our program Composer of the Week. I'm Dragana Jevtovic, and tonight I'm focusing on the music of Hendrik Hofmeyr. You have just heard the piece Quiete from a song cycle Tre liriche in stile antico, which means quiet songs in olden, three songs in olden style, composed by Hendrik Hofmeyr in 1982. It was performed by Zaan Stapelberg, soprano, and Hendrik Hofmeyr was playing the piano. Hendrik Hofmeyr was born in Cape Town on the 20th of November 1957. He has been described as South Africa's most performed composer of classical music. He won numerous South African awards, including the South African Opera Competition and annual Nederburg Prize with The Fall of the House of Usher. Recently, he received the UCT Creative Arts Award for his second symphony, The Elements. Besides this, he has achieved considerable international recognition, winning the first prize in an international competition in Italy with his music from a short film by Wim Wenders. In 1997, he won the Queen Elizabeth of Belgium music competition with Raptus for violin and orchestra, and later the Dimitris Mitropoulos competition in Athens with Byzantium for high voice and orchestra. Last year, a CD of his works entitled Partita Africana was chosen as CD of the Month by the French magazine Classica. This is just a small selection from a long list of prizes and awards. After his initial musical education in South Africa, Hendrik Hofmeyr spent 10 years in Italy furthering his studies, but made regular visits to his homeland. He's currently professor and head of composition and theory at the South African College of Music at the University of Cape Town, where he obtained his doctorate in music in 1999. Hofmeyr has completed more than 100 commissioned works for renowned musicians in South Africa and abroad. His oeuvre includes 6 operas, 2 ballets, 11 concerti and other orchestral works, 2 string quartets, numerous chamber and instrumental works, and many choral and solo works and vocal works. Generations of young South Africans have performed his works at eisteddfods and competitions, and his works have been a subject of a large number of theses and doctoral dissertations. I have a surprise for you. Because of the nature of this program, it doesn't happen often that the composer can be physically present with us. But here is Hendrik Hofmeyr sitting opposite me in the Fine Music Radio studio, and this is a live program. Good evening, Hendrik.
Thank you very much, Dragana. It's a great privilege to be here, and very good evening to all your listeners as well.
I'm really glad you could make it and that we could make this program. I think it was long overdue.
Thank you so much.
And we'll make more. You have had a very full life, but this evening I would like to focus on the works themselves, the process of composition, and your musical objectives. Modern classical music is still a challenge for many. How do you see yourself as an exponent of this genre, placed between the new sets of musical idiom and expressiveness, beauty, melody, harmony, and tonality?
Well, that is a very, very big question, and I will try to keep the answer as simple and as short as possible. Look, I started off being very interested in composing from, I would say, my teenage. And initially I was, I suppose, fairly avant-gardist and as rebellious as most teenagers would be. But I soon realized that writing that particular kind of music was perhaps more interesting and satisfying to the composer than to most listeners. And very soon revised my ideas. By the time I went to university, I was firmly convinced that tonality was not dead, as we were being told it was.
Thank you.
And that melody and harmony were really not replaceable by any of the things that the organizers of sound, of the sort of avant-garde were trying to convince us that it was. So yes, I think the avant-garde really created a new art form, which I would prefer to call organized sound, which I think functions according to its own rules and can be very interesting and very exciting, but doesn't necessarily replace what I would consider music. I know this is all very contentious stuff, but that is really the philosophy that I have embraced and that I have tried to realize in my works. I think the avant-garde alienated many people who love classical music and many concert goers who simply run a mile when they hear that there's anything written after 1950 on the program. And I think that is a huge pity. I love classical music, and I love contemporary classical music in the way that I define music. And I think through this 20th century, there also were a great many composers who still thought exactly as I did. I can mention just a few, Benjamin Britten, Shostakovich, just to mention two names, who were, of course, at the time really snubbed by the avant-garde, who thought they were traitors to the cause and were not nearly innovative and modern enough, but whose music has certainly endured and who kept alive a way of interacting with the traditions of classical music, which I find particularly stimulating and interesting, and it is within that tradition that I try to place myself as well.
We're going to see also some proofs of that in the next piece that we're going to hear, because we have chosen together a Concerto for Flute and Orchestra that was written in 1999, and we're going to hear the first movement. It was commissioned by Helen Vosloo, is that right? Or requested?
It was a request by Helen Vosloo, yes.
And she's playing in this recording with National Symphony Orchestra. And when I was listening to it, I found traces of Tchaikovsky. So your quotes, but as you might want to explain that those are quotes of quotes, and this. So please, listeners, when you listen to this, you will hear a tiny drop of Swan Lake. But please tell me about it.
Well, as I said just now, I think for me, writing classical music is in a way, the interaction of an individual and an individual's personality and sensibilities with the tradition, because it's a very long and a very important and rich tradition. And I think many composers have chosen to make that interaction also at times very literal, and you are quite right that there is something that is Swan Lake-ish about the first theme of the first movement.
Nanosecond, but it's
well, maybe even more. But at the same time, for me, that Swan Lake is already referencing the first theme from Schubert's Unfinished Symphony, and both pieces have this lyrical but slightly uneasy melody over an accompaniment which also seems to suggest uneasy waters and a kind of state of flux. And just as Tchaikovsky, I think, referenced Schubert, I in turn, because both these works really get to my guts in no certain terms. So they obviously respond to something that I feel I would also like to express.
On the shoulders of giants.
On the shoulders of giants. And in fact, it is not really as I'm trying to hide the fact, because the key I've chosen is in fact the same key as the key of the unfinished B minor. So the reference is definitely there, and I'm very glad that you picked up on it, and I hope that everyone who hears the piece makes the same association.
Yeah, it made me smile. So let's hear it. So Helen Vosloo and National Symphony Orchestra, and Concerto for Flute and Orchestra composed by my guest tonight, Professor Hendrik Hofmeyr. Thank you.
Right, Dragana, I think we forgot to mention that the conductor here was Emmanuel Siffert with the National Symphony Orchestra and with Helen Vosloo as soloist.
Yes, well, thank you. This was, I hope that the listener caught the Swan Lake moment.
Right, right.
This is Fine Music Radio. This is a live program, and I'm Dragana Jevtovic, and I'm very, very pleased to have in my studio my guest, Professor Hendrik Hofmeyr, who is talking about his music. So this is Composer of the Week, and he's not just Composer of the Week, he's just our composer. So, besides being a composer, you are the master and magician of harmony, of music theory, harmonic analysis, and your compositional toolbox contains harmonic symbolism and expanded tonality. They play a vital role in the tonal sensations you want to achieve. Now, what I would like to ask is, how do you get from your toolbox to the point where the listener can react to the harmonic change and be fascinated and touched? How do you do this magic?
Gosh, I don't know if I can answer that one, but all I can say is, yes, harmony for me is a very, very potent conveyor of meaning. And I always hope that the meaning that it conveys to me will be, at least for some listeners, something similar. So I suppose I am a firm believer in music as a language and a carrier of meaning, and not everyone, again, agrees with that view. But certainly the music that I love conveys meaning to me, and I try to write music that also conveys meaning. And I think from the feedback I've had from certain people, I feel that some of that message is getting through. So, yes, I spend a lot of time at the piano and sometimes just in my head thinking about harmony and the things that harmony can do and the things that my favorite composers have done in harmony and how I can, again, take that and
premeditated.
Yes, and build on it and take it one step further still. So, yes, I would say harmony and melody are for me both absolutely vital elements in a musical language, and especially in my own musical language. I know some people have managed to write great music without necessarily relying on those things, but yes, for me, they're indispensable.
And now I would like to play a short piece, Genesis for Mixed Choir, and that is commissioned by Leon Starker for Pro Canto Choir, and now then they changed the name to Cape Youth Choir. But I would like you to tell our listeners more about this very, very special piece and the way you've treated the voice and to tell us about aleatoric clouds. And also, if you wouldn't mind, just to read the text, because I think that is important.
Good. I think I'll start with that because I suppose the things that I do were all kind of inspired by the text. So although I'm sure the text will be familiar to many of your listeners, here it is. It's the beginning of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. So, yes, the piece itself, of course, offers many opportunities to a composer who's interested in conveying meaning and mood and message. The fact that it starts with darkness and void is already a kind of inspiration to use the choir in certain ways, the dark, low register notes. I've always also thought that when a choir sings in unison, it produces dark, almost threatening kind of sound, and the piece in fact starts with something like that. But then it also employs overtone singing, which usually involves a drone on a fairly low note, and the singers gradually changing each one individually from I or, and this creates kind of arbitrary overtone patterns which have a very eerie and mysterious quality, which I think went very well for me with the idea not only of the darkness and the void, but also eventually of the Spirit of God moving across the waters. At that point, I also introduce aleatoric singing, which means that each member of the choir sings the same line, but individually. So you get these thin, ghostly, eerie lines, and at the same time, other members of the choir are whispering and doing wind sounds where they just whistle more or less voicelessly. And all this, of course, when the darkness is suddenly transformed into light, uses one of my favorite harmonic progressions from a very dark chord to a very luminous one. And then the music, of course, becomes more radiant, more rational, more, if you like, conventional, less reliant on effect and more on the conventions of melody and harmony and counterpoint. So light also in the sense of moving towards that rational and analyzable entity that we traditionally consider music to be.
Let's hear it. And this was Genesis for Mixed Choir, composed in 2009 by my guest composer of the week, Hendrik Hofmeyr. And this was commissioned by Leon Starker for Pro Canto Choir, and it was performed by the Cape Town Youth Choir, which sort of overlaps. Yeah. Thank you, Leon Starker, for this. And thank you for composing.
Well, I must say a big thank you to the performers. I think it's a very, very challenging work.
And they did it.
Especially for young people, and often not necessarily people who are musicians in the first place, who do music as a kind of extra activity. And I think they did magnificently.
I think they did magnificently. In which way, I would like to know, is contemporary classical music different from the canons of the past? Is it helpful to consider modern music more advanced, or is it just different? If so, how do we measure what is advanced?
Oh, again, very big and profound questions.
Sorry.
I think it's very difficult to talk about, let's say, being more advanced than Bach, for instance. I think Bach is as advanced as one could possibly wish to be, in terms of the tools and the means and the language that was at his disposal. And I think we have come to a stage in history where we, in any case, kind of discount the idea of progress being a kind of linear thing which always goes forward and which means that we are constantly getting better at what we do. I think the wonderful thing about modern music for me is the fact that we have so much at our disposal to draw from and to build on. We are, in fact, really only limited by our own prejudices. And I find it regrettable when some people tell me, oh, this is what modern music should be doing and it shouldn't be doing that. I think it's very easy to become almost a little bit of a fascist and saying, thou shalt not commit this. And, of course, that was a very fashionable tendency, especially in the 20th century, when there were entire schools devoted to not writing melody, not writing harmony, and casting anyone who did into the outer darkness. I think most composers nowadays, thankfully, have kind of gotten beyond that, and we do allow ourselves, in a way, to do almost anything. I think for me, and I always say this to my students as well, the important thing is really to be true to yourself and to discover what are the things in music that speak to you. In your own music, in your improvisations, in trying out things on the piano, but also, of course, in listening to other composers. The things that speak to you because something inside you responds to that. And those are the things that you should be investigating, finding out how they work, what you can do, what they say for you, what you can make them say in new and different ways to what other people have done. But really, there shouldn't be a kind of grand model of what a music should sound like today. I think the more diverse and varied it is, the better. And the more people can express what they feel they want to express in music, also the better. So, yes, I don't hold myself up as an example of anything that anyone should emulate. In fact, I always say to my students, if your music begins to sound too much like mine, I'll penalize you for it. So I think everyone needs to find their own language. And that can range from everything, from whatever makes your hair stand on end, whether it be medieval plain chant, whether it be Penderecki, anything in between. It can be all of those things, and it can, in fact, have all those things interact as well. I think it's one of the wonderful things about the 21st century that we have discarded the idea of a kind of grand narrative where everyone has to conform to a kind of monolithic idea of what any particular art form should look or sound like. So I always encourage everyone to, just enjoy themselves and express what is most meaningful to them. Because I think if it is meaningful to them, it will be meaningful to others as well.
Thank you. And what I would also suggest, and I do that myself, is that because it is new for a listener, one should not comply with this, that aesthetically pleasing is only the thing that we know. So listening again and listening again to another piece, I can tell for myself, even when I was preparing for this program, on the first listening, it's not the same as later. And then new universes, new spaces start opening. And that is what we should be granting to the new music, because we have listened over and over and over again to Beethoven and Bach and many things. We listen again.
Indeed, absolutely.
So we need to give it a chance to listen again.
I couldn't agree more. Yes, that is exactly the way also that I learned to love music that was written, if you like, after about 1850. Up to 1850, most things we can more or less understand at first hearing, but music does become more complex and in some senses more sophisticated after that, and it often can be bewildering to the human brain to take it all in the first time. The human brain is also a creature of habit, and it needs to form those synapses between the various parts of the brain and discover new ways of connecting various areas of the brain. And yes,
the paths open.
Absolutely. And meaning in music, which for me on first hearing was not only bewildering, but really almost meaningless, gradually as my brain got used to processing it, became for me amongst the most wonderful and adventurous and exciting music to discover.
And there are so many details, and then they start popping in later when you just give it a chance.
Absolutely.
If we could give it a chance, as much chance as we gave to the others, I
Indeed.
think that
no one could ask for more than that.
World would be different. Now we have a beautiful piece, one of my favorites. There are so many that I love that you've written. This is a Rhapsodia Nocturna, Nocturnal Rhapsody, and it was commissioned by Louise Smith for Cornelis Smith and Goran Krivokapic, my compatriot. And it is here performed by Goran Krivokapic on the guitar and Cornelis Smith on the piano. And piano and guitar are an unusual combination. How have you exploited the potential of these instruments in this composition?
Look, you're quite right. It is a very unusual combination, and for very good reason. The guitar is, of course, a very intimate and a very delicate instrument, and very easily overpowered by our modern concert grand. But, of course, ultimately they are both stringed instruments of a percussive nature. They produce their sound by strings being struck in various ways. So I try to focus on that primarily, and to see where I could find kind of interfaces between the way sound is produced on the two instruments, at times producing almost plucked sounds on the piano, and dampening of strings to make the sound much smaller, and then also using techniques on the guitar that make the instrument really as resonant and as incisive as possible. But then, of course, also the wonderful opportunities to juxtapose those things that make the two instruments so individual and so different to each other. So the piece kind of is almost like a conversation between these two very different characters who do have some areas where they meet, and then some areas where they are quite far apart. And I've also had the audacity to kind of include in the latter part a kind of fugal section where they really have
I love that part.
Connect very intimately with each other. But yes, I will let the listeners judge for themselves, whether they think that this attempt at making these two opposites meet was successful or not.
I vote for yes. So here is Rhapsodia Nocturna. 2007 is the year of composing this. Hendrik Hofmeyr, my guest tonight, has composed this, and it is performed by Goran Krivokapic, guitar, and Cornelis Smith, piano. And this was Rhapsodia Nocturna, commissioned by Louis Smith for Cornelis Smith and Goran Krivokapic. Goran Krivokapic guitar, Cornelis Smith piano, and it was composed by my guest, Hendrik Hofmeyr, here on Fine Music Radio. It is nearly 9 o'clock. This is a live program. We're here in the studio discussing Professor Hofmeyr's music. Now, vocal music carries a tonal quality, as well as the message that the voice delivers, which comes from literature, especially poetry. You have composed a lot of works for the voice, and I assume that the voice holds a fascination for you. Tell me about it.
Absolutely, yes. I think it is the greatest of all instruments and ultimately the most expressive. And I suppose my love of the voice comes also from a very early age. My mother was a great aficionado of the Lied. She had those huge Deutsche Grammophon boxes of all the Schubert, all the Liszt, all the Schumann, all the Wolf. And we would, of an evening, sit and listen to these. And I also, of course, love poetry and the very fruitful possibility of interface and interaction between these two art forms has always been for me a very fascinating one. I think I would say about 50% of my oeuvre is vocal, and that is considered very high. In fact, even 30% would be considered high as an average for composers. But yes, in a way, it's perhaps the easiest thing for me to write, because I find the poems, and I always select the poems very carefully to be the ones that I think my music can enhance in some way. But there is so much inspiration already just in the poem that the setting becomes almost spontaneous. The things that are suggested by the poem just have to be turned into music. And yes, there's very little, shall I say, of kind of artificial construction for me when it comes to setting poetry. I find always that for me the vocal line is very, very important and must not only convey the meaning of the poem even by itself without the accompaniment, but it must also be crafted in such a way that it allows the singer to express exactly what you and what the singer might want to express with the words and the sentiments in the poem. And of course music has that wonderful potential to kind of excavate all the worlds that lie behind the words and fill in all the things that the poem might only evoke or suggest. In fact, very often the type of poetry that I prefer and that I think is easiest to set is fairly succinct and not too explicit, not too overt, not too much given to explaining everything, because one feels that the music can do that. I know Verdi always told his librettisti, sintetizzare, signori. In other words, condense. I don't need all those words. The music can say it, so I don't need so many words. And I think the great poets, for the most part, were the ones also who knew how to almost distill a sentiment and word, and something that normally would be in prose conveyed in 1,000 words, they can say in 20 words. That, for me, is the kind of poetry that is ideal for setting to music.
So I would like to play Kinderland from your song cycle Alien State, with poems by Sidney Vernon Peterson and performed by Andre Howard, baritone, and you played the piano. Please tell me how you have conveyed the feelings of nostalgia, lost innocence, and isolation that are depicted in the text. I see all these fifths, these open fifths.
Very good, yes. The piece opens with a chord built in superimposed open fifths, and of course we hear that kind of chord when we hear the orchestra tune up. So it is used here almost as a symbol of innocence and of dawn and the beginning of things.
Can you tell the listeners about, in short, about the meaning of this fifth, about the emptiness of the fifth?
Yes, look, I suppose everyone who hears it, we call it open because we all hear it as somehow empty, as being not.
It was used to be forbidden.
Yes, indeed, yes. Yeah, of course, also within the overtone series, that series of sounds that is generated by any single note we hear, the first note after we hear the octave, which is the same note really, just a bit higher as the one we hear, the next note up would be the fifth. So it is also a kind of primary musical entity. And of course, in the music of the grand tradition, which we can say goes from the Baroque maybe till the end of the 19th century, that fifth was always filled in by a third, which gives us that lovely
determination.
Yes, the triad, major or minor. Without that third, of course, we are a little bit at a loss to decide where we are, and maybe that uneasiness also feeds into the slightly strange quality of the open fifth. But if you put enough open fifths on top of each other, you actually get to that third eventually, which is what this opening chord does. So it is both sweet but also kind of transparent and spacious in a way which to me suggests a kind of natural innocence. And throughout this cycle, that innocence is gradually corrupted in various ways, because that is what Peterson's poems are about various states of corruption and how to return to a world of innocence. In this particular song, which comes in the middle of the cycle, he's really recalling that lost world of the innocence of his childhood. And the music itself tries to also convey this through that most obvious musical symbol of memory, which is the canon. So whatever the voice sings in the first three verses when he evokes his childhood world is echoed in the piano almost like a distant memory, reverberating somewhere inside his spirit. And then in the latter part of the poem, things become rather darker as he wakes up to the dreary reality of the city where he lives. And then in the postlude on the piano, little snippets of the opening three verses and that lost world of innocence gradually kind of fade away in the piano part. So, yes, there are very clear evocations of the idea of memory, both as a canonic device, but then also as something that is recalled from earlier in the song and which gradually, in fact, disappears in the dreary present.
And for our listeners to understand it more, I would like to ask you to read the poem in Afrikaans, because it's in Afrikaans, and then I will read it in English.
Fantastic.
Before we play Andre Howard's performance of it.
The poem is called Kinderland. Sou daar in my wonderwêreld soms nog kinders kaalvoet klouter, opdraand teen die taaibosrand? Pluk hulle bessies, skilpadbessies, donkerrooies, bruines, geeles, nou nog in my kinderland? Geur dit nog van peperbossies en renoster, waar die aarde oop lê teen die hemelrand? Hoe verleë doel ons dikwels mymerend deur die verre strate, moeg van stad en stadskoerant, hunkerend tussen die skare, eenling, eensaam in ons wese, ver van huis en kinderland.
And in English, land of childhood. Could there, in that world of wonder, still be children scrambling barefoot up the ridge where the taibos grows? Do they still pick berries, tortoise berries, dark red, brown, and golden ones in the land of my childhood? Is the air still fragrant with paper and renosterbos, where the earth lies open against heaven's rim? How forlorn and lost in thought we often wander the distant city streets, weary of all that life is there, yearning among the multitude, lonely and forsaken exiles, far from home and childhood's land. So now we have from Alien State Kinderland, and it was commissioned by the South African Music Rights Organization for the Dion van der Walt Masterclasses, recorded from a live performance at the Endler Hall by Andre Howard baritone and Hendrik Hofmeyr piano. And that was Kinderland from Alien Strait, composed by my guest, Hendrik Hofmeyr. This is a live program. You've been very quiet. You can contact us on WhatsApp 061-799-1013. We are here with more music. It is now 9:11. Dragana Jevtovic with Hendrik Hofmeyr. Sergei is there too, don't worry, but he's been very quiet. He's enchanted by the music. And we are here until 10 o'clock. Hendrik, could we say that there are periods in your opus, and has your music changed over time?
Well, quite a fraught question. I think probably less so than for most composers. I think my philosophy of allowing myself to utilize whatever I see fit on any given occasion means that I quite often go back to my toolbox for things that I might have used in a very early composition or in a middle period composition, and I'm now just talking in terms of time rather than in terms of style. So I think perhaps my toolbox has become fuller over time, and I therefore have more things that I now can use, and that is probably some form of development. But yes, in terms of the music, shall we say, becoming more complex or more dissonant or less complex and less dissonant, I wouldn't say that there is a straight trajectory. Some pieces do become more complex, some become more dissonant, but then the very next piece might in fact go back to a very simple style and a very straightforward harmonic language also. For me, it all depends on what I'm trying to say with that particular piece. Very often, if it's a setting, obviously, if the text is simple and straightforward, I will try to respect that and not clothe it in garb that is not suited to its body. And I really apply the same principle in my instrumental music as well. For me, every piece that I write starts with the idea of what am I trying to convey? What is the message in the piece? And if that message is one of simplicity, I will use simple language, quite regardless of the fact that maybe as a composer in his late period, I should be doing one thing or the other.
It's not late period, it's a sort of early middle period.
Too kind.
Always. So the toolbox is just getting bigger.
I suppose,
and you're
yes.
getting very dexterous.
Look, I think for me, that is the one thing that I do believe in, is that one never stops discovering and learning and finding new things. And whenever I do find something new, I'm immediately eager to see if I can somehow find the right piece in which to use it. But that never means that I forget about my old friends in the toolbox.
And
either.
you don't forget who you are.
No, I think I never try to be what I know I am not. And as I said to you earlier, that's what I also advise my students to be. I think to be true to oneself is very important. And of course, you must first discover who you are also. And I think for students, that is often a difficult process. So it takes them a bit of time, but it is a wonderful journey and an adventure of discovery. So I think in a way I'm still on that journey. And if I can just quickly tell you a little anecdote, my wonderful, wonderful mentor and piano teacher, Laura Searle, said to me one day when I was battling with a Mozart sonata 2 weeks before the exam, and I said to her, Miss Searle, I don't think I'm ever going to get this. She said, don't be silly. I know the reason you chose music. You chose music because you know you'll never get it. There's always the beyond in music, and that is why you're fascinated. You can never put it in your hand and say, I've got you. There will always be that further horizon beyond what you've got. And I suppose that is ultimately why I did choose music, because there is always the beyond and always the next thing to be found and discovered and celebrated.
It's always, the future is there.
Indeed.
Now let us hear Concerto for Piano and Orchestra. You composed that in 1998, and we have a second movement here. And will you tell me? It's in memoriam of...
Yes, it was actually, the concerto was started, Melanie Horn, who was a wonderful South African pianist, and a colleague of mine at the University of Stellenbosch had asked me for a concerto, and I'd barely started writing it when, unfortunately, she passed away. So this slow movement, the whole concerto is really dedicated to her and inspired by various aspects of her wonderful personality. But this slow movement is really almost like an elegy. And like so many of the great elegies in the classical tradition, it uses what we call a ground bass, a slowly descending, creeping downwards bass pattern, which of course in itself is almost a symbol of decline and demise in the end. So this bass pattern is repeated over and over again with variations on top of it, and also goes from a mood that is elegiac in the first place, but gradually moves towards, if you like, transcendence, towards the light.
Let's hear it, and it is performed by Francois de Toy and National Symphony Orchestra. What a beautiful ending. This was the second movement of Concerto for Piano and Orchestra in memoriam of Melanie Horn. I can just see her spirit going with this last violin. It was performed by Francois de Toy and National Symphony Orchestra and composed by my guest tonight, Professor Hendrik Hofmeyr. Hendrik, if it were possible, which composer from the past would you like to have had with us in the studio now?
I would say Bach. I suppose almost any composer would say Bach.
Yeah, sorry, I did not switch on your microphone. So it is
Bach.
Why?
Oh, gosh. I think the reasons are very hard to put into words, but he just seemed to do everything he did so superbly. And I think it's an object lesson to any composer in how to take certain materials and just use them magnificently in a way that is so original and creative and striking and meaningful. One always talks to one's students about the idea of economy of means, of using just a few elements and making, if you like, a small piece out of it, but also even a vast edifice. And Bach is always the first example that leaps to mind of someone who just knew where every note had to go. So, yes, I suppose if there is a god of music for me, that god is Bach.
And what do you think he would say listening to contemporary music?
Very hard to say. Very hard to say. He
would listen more than once, I'm sure.
I would hope so, yes. And I hope he would find some meaning in it. Of course, it would be hard for him to have to listen to it without having heard all the intervening styles. I think music has been
traveling.
It's been traveling, yes. I wouldn't say a progression because that seems to imply that we're getting better, but yes, it has definitely moved, and I think it's hard to leap within that without following the complete movement from what happened after Bach and how already just 100 years after Bach, people already looking back and saying, whoa, what about Bach? Rediscovering Bach and just finding that there were so many wonderful things in Bach's music that the generation that immediately followed him had neglected or had thought were kind of old hat and fuddy-duddy and were looking for neater, more elegant, more transparent things. So yes, Bach seems to come back almost in waves. Every 100 years people say, what about Bach? And seem to rediscover him again.
And what other influences have been in your music? Some other composers or something else?
A great many, for a great many different reasons. I would go all the way back to even composers of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, like acclaim, Dunstable, the names are so many, Doland, and then on to people also, the Italians, especially in terms of opera from Monteverdi onwards. But I think all the great Italian operatic composers for me very important. And of course, that wonderful German tradition that we all grew up with, Beethoven, Mozart, Schubert, for whom I have a very, very particular soft spot, Schumann, Chopin, Brahms. Oh, gosh, the list goes on and on. I would say Brahms, perhaps a particular soft spot. And then also, for me, a composer that I love dearly and that I think is very undervalued, Gabriel Fauré, the French composer who really invented an incredibly advanced way of thinking about music and applied it so effortlessly that people really don't even notice that what he's doing is actually pure revolution. In a way, for me, that is the kind of composing I find most fascinating. I suppose one would say you have the loud revolutionaries, and then you have the quiet revolutionaries. And the quiet revolutionaries perhaps rely more on the listener making the discovery and finding it for themselves rather than kind of ramming it down their throats. Not that I don't mind someone like Wagner, who, of course, was wonderful at ramming things down people's throats and convincing them whether they want to be convinced or not. I suppose that's why people are so either pro-Wagner or anti-Wagner. I am very, very pro-Wagner. But yes, the list of composers, if we would then go into the 20th century, there are just so many. Debussy, Ravel, both of them wonderful composers. Szymanowski, the Polish composer for me.
Karol Szymanowski.
Oh, absolutely wonderful music. I have a very, very soft spot also for Prokofiev and for Benjamin Britten, for Messiaen. The list goes on and on.
Shall we now have a short piece, Pie Jesu for mixed choir and pro arte singers, and Arthur Sjogren?
Yes, sung in this case by an American choir. Arthur has done a lot for South African composers. He's performed South African choral music quite frequently. This piece was written, it's the only piece I ever wrote in a single sitting, because I'm generally quite a slow composer. But I'd learned on a Sunday morning while I was writing something completely different, that my wonderful teacher, Laura Sill, had passed away. And I thought, I can't just go on with life as if nothing had happened. So I just sat down and wrote this piece, which was then performed for the first time at her funeral.
Let's have it now. And that was Pie Jesu for mixed choir, performed by pro arte singers. How important is form in your composition? On the first glance, we don't perceive the form. On occasion, you have compared form to the structure of the human body, which supports the outside appearance. So we see the outside appearance.
Indeed, yes. For me, form is vitally important. I don't think it's possible to write music of the kind that interests me without form being very much present and a vital consideration in the composer's mind. But for me, it is a bit like the skeleton. It is vital to the beauty of the human form, and without it, there would be no beauty. But we don't look at someone and say, wow, what a beautiful skeleton. So for me, form fulfills pretty much that role. It is there to make all the other elements in the music be exposed to their greatest advantage, and it can often also play an incredibly important role in terms of the emotional or dramatic narrative of the work. If you think how important that moment is in sonata form when the first theme comes back at the recapitulation, and how different composers have treated that moment in so many different ways as part of the narrative of the piece as a whole. So those considerations are vitally important. I think many times the listeners will only really hear them as moments of emotive intensity or relaxation, and perceive them almost in a way subconsciously without necessarily analyzing them as they
without necessarily being doctors of the form.
Yes. But look, I can tell from personal experience that the more you investigate the form and listen out for the form, the richer your musical experience and even the emotional aspect of that musical experience becomes. The recurrence of thematic material, of course, is a vitally important element in music, at least since the 1600s and before. And for me, that thematic process is one of the things that I've found when it was abandoned in the 20th century was really a tragic loss, and one that I certainly engage with in my own works. And I think the more listeners can cultivate that sense of listening to a theme and how it returns, how it is modified, how it can interact with other themes, the richer is the experience of the work as a whole. So yes, I never divorce form from emotion and expression and narrative. For me, it is vitally important in creating that and in supporting that in the other parameters that we find in music.
Because then we are more aware of the drama that is happening between the themes and how they
absolutely yes
give way one to the other. And
indeed, yes. I think music in a way is memory made living. If you think about it, when we listen to a piece of music, it's a bit like looking at an artwork through a keyhole. You can only see a tiny little bit of it in each individual moment.
Because it's in function of time.
Yes, your memory actually constructs the whole. And the more your memory is activated by thematic usage and thematic recurrence, the more that whole becomes something incredibly vital and meaningful and organic and alive.
Thank you for that. So now we have a rather new CD, Hofmeyr Duo Sonatas.
Oh, yes.
And I'm glad that I have that. And we have chosen from your Sonata number 1 for violin and piano, we have chosen the third movement.
Right.
Right? Performed by Alisa Margulis and Nina Schumann.
Indeed, wonderful performance. Yes, and I should perhaps just mention some people might notice a little bit of cross rhythm in that first theme, which in this case is directly inspired by the kind of cross rhythms and rapid rhythmic pulses that we find in many African musics as well, interpreted in this case in a I suppose a slightly individual way. I'm not trying to sound like pseudo-African music, but it certainly is my kind of response to things that I have found exciting in African music.
Let's hear it. And this was the third movement of Sonata for Violin and Piano by Hendrik Hofmeyr, my guest, and it was performed by Alisa Margulis and Nina Schumann. Alisa Margulis, violin, Nina Schumann, piano, of course. Hendrik, when you are commissioned to write a piece, how do you go about it? What role, if any, does a listener or a commissioner play in your creative process? And is it necessary to compromise sometimes? Because I think the music comes from within you and it now reaches a listener. Now, do you ask yourself, will they receive? Shall I go full blast or shall I...
Well, I think I get where you're going with this. Look, I think it's vitally important to always bear the listener in mind. And again, I think the great composers have shown us that is the way to go. I always quote a preface from Mozart's collection of 6 piano concerti, where he wrote in the introduction, I think you will find that there is something in these works for the connoisseur and something for the amateur. And I think if you look at what composers have done through the ages, they've always tried to put something in their works which maybe only the enlightened, the educated will be able to fully appreciate, but they've always made sure that there's also something for someone who really just wants to enjoy the experience of listening to the work. I think art in general that is not interested in compromise is in a way extreme and dead, because any form of complete extremism is really rather like death. Life is made up out of constant compromise. And for me, it's not really a question of saying, okay, I have to betray my own convictions. I want to reach listeners, and therefore it's very, very important for me what kind of thing will reach them. But yeah, to get back to the issue of commissions, for me, the commission itself is a source of inspiration. The fact that you are writing for a specific medium and knowing and finding out what that medium is capable of, what it does best, what it maybe does not do so well, an instrument, let's say like the clarinet, for me is almost like a personality, like an actor that you know, and you say, okay, what kind of role will I write for this actor?
Yes.
So that in itself is inspiration. I really don't need more than that to get me going. And yes, I think that works, whoever the commissioning body or person might be also. Sometimes you're writing for a specific performance, sometimes just for a specific instrument. But if it's a specific performer, it's even greater, because if you know the person and what they do best, it's wonderful to be able to write for that.
Now we have something else that is from your new CD, Partita Africana. And we chose Kalunga, Marika Hofmeyr playing the piano. Kalunga, tell me about Kalunga. Sounds very
right. Kalunga
sounds eerie.
It is rather.
It's going to come and get us.
Indeed. Yes. Kalunga is the god of the netherworld in the Nguni mythology, and obviously also the god of death, and one who is perpetually busy with his activities of, I suppose, eliminating mankind. So the piece is cast rather like the previous one in a kind of perpetual mobile style with a constant, very rapid triple pulse. And this never stops from beginning to end. And again, there are the kind of cross rhythms that one would associate with certain types of African musics. So it's almost, yes, like a companion piece to the preceding one.
So let's hear that. Marika Hofmeyr, who is your relative and colleague, is that right?
Yes, we're sort of 8 generations apart in terms of being very remote cousins, but we were at university together actually, and she's a very good friend.
She plays, for me it's like 2 people playing here.
She plays wonderfully.
It's really fantastic. So let's listen from Partita Africana, Opus 95, number 4, Kalunga. Well, that's quite something. And Kalunga got us at the end.
Right.
So that was Partita Africana Opus 95, Marika Hofmeyr, and composed by my guest tonight, Hendrik Hofmeyr. So let's wrap it up and tell me, would you identify yourself with any particular trend or school of composing?
Look, as I've said before, I think I tend to be a bit of a maverick in terms of taking from whatever school, whatever I like. But you did mention to me in passing that you think I'm a romantic, and I think you are absolutely right.
That you are a romantic after all. You're guilty.
I'm guilty. I think for me, all the great composers, essentially, there was a German musicologist who said all great composers are really romantics. In fact, he considered everyone from the earliest schools, even from the classical school, composers like Haydn and Mozart. He said what made them different to all the other classical composers, and the reason why we listen to them far more, is all the elements that make them more interesting are romantic elements. And I agree with that 100%. I think Monteverdi was a romantic for his time. Yeah. I think Mozart, definitely romantic. And of course, Beethoven took the classical era and turned it into the romantic era. But I think one can say that generally the romantic tendency to add content and value to every moment in the music is one that I very firmly believe in and that I aspire to in my own music.
Thank you very much for being my guest. Thank you for being a romantic and continue being that.
Thank you so much.
And I will continue playing your music. Dear listeners, thank you very much for listening. This was Composer of the Week, and my guest was live here from the studios of Fine Music Radio, Professor Hendrik Hofmeyr, with his music, and discover why is he a romantic. Listen to the music. From me, Dragana Jevtovic, all the best, and I will see you on Wednesday for What a Wonderful World at 10 o'clock. Hendrik, good night and thank you.
Good night and thank you very much.
Bye-bye.